office in Ukraine. Engage program funded by the USAID and PACT in Ukraine. There is support from the UNICEF as well. With me in the studio, I'm happy to welcome Anna Sukhadolska, who runs the Unit for Behavioral and Social Communications of UNICEF in Ukraine. Hello, everybody. Over the next hour and a half, we're going to speak with international experts about behavioral insights. We're going to have it from the Behavioural Science professor of the London School of Economics, Mr. Paul Dolan. Professor Dolan is well known in this field, and his recommendations are widely used by the British government agencies to draft respective lines of policy. He spent 20 years researching into happiness, why it happens, and what it means for an individual and society at large. His latest research is about human behavior over the time of the COVID pandemic. This time, Professor Dolan chose a provocative title of the presentation: COVID will change the world a lot less than is predicted now. So me and Anna will see what exactly is going to change and what will remain as it was before. There will be simultaneous interpretation going, but you can follow this live, direct, if you choose the English channel. Or you stay in this channel if you want to get interpretations. So let's now have it from Mr. Dolan.
Paul, hello. Do you hear us?
Oh, I can hear you now. Yes,
Oh,
I didn't hear
cool.
anything. I didn't hear anything before.
Yeah, cool. We are very glad to see you here virtually in Kyiv. How are you? It is your first speech performance for Ukrainian audience.
It's my first trip to the Ukraine. Definitely, yes.
Hope to see you next time in person in Kyiv. You're more
That
than
would be
welcome.
so nice, wouldn't it? Thank you.
Kyiv really is a very hospitable city, and besides, it's just a treasure trove for any social and behavioral research. That's true.
Yeah, no, I'm sure it is. It'd be absolutely fascinating to come over there. I didn't hear. I don't know if you did. You introduce me before?
Yeah, sure, definitely.
Yeah. Okay. I didn't hear any of that, so I don't
More
know
than
what
enough.
you said about me. I hope it was all very kind.
It was very kind and it was very true. Good afternoon, Professor
Oh,
Dolan.
very kind and true. Oh, okay. Well,
Yes.
good. Excellent. Thank you.
So we see the title of your speech is quite provocative. You are actually doubting the words of many experts who say that world has dramatically changed after the pandemic and during the pandemic. So we want to know more about that from your end, and every provocation needs explanation. So please, we welcome you here, welcome you in Kyiv once again, and would like to have your speech now.
Yeah, thank you so much. So there's one thing that I'm confident about, and one thing that I'm not confident about. So let's deal with let's leave the lack of confidence issue till later. The one thing I am very confident about is a vast array of literature at the individual level, which shows two things. One is that many of the things that we intend to change about ourselves and about the world, we don't change. So there's an intention behavior gap. It's a well rehearsed area of interest. There's lots of academic research showing that the things that people say they will do very rarely translate into real behaviors. I think that there's two fundamental reasons why that's the case. One is, I mean, think about this in the context of a New Year's resolution, right? That's a very good example. We're now into February. Pretty much all of the resolutions I would think that people made when they were drunk, New Year's Eve on the 31st of December or sometime early into January, have now pretty much disappeared and gone. That they're not doing the things that they intended to, or they are still doing the things that they thought they would stop. And there's two fundamental reasons why there's an intention behavior gap. One is that actually a lot of the things that we say that we'd like to change, we don't really want to, right? So, when people make a New Year's resolution to read more novels or something, or to exercise more or something, some of them might want to do that, but many of them are saying that because they think they ought to, because it feels like the right kind of thing to say. It feels consistent with some sort of narrative that they might have of themselves, or that they would like other people to believe about them. The second reason, insofar as there is something that we really do want to change, and we would ultimately be happier from doing so, is that we're not very good at being able to think about the ways in which we would embed that behaviour sustainably into the longer term. So I might have an intention to read more books or something, but that requires me to implement the intention. It's not just to say I'm going to do it. It requires me to enact a series of discrete steps that make it more likely that I'm going to read more books. I need to join a book club. I need to surround myself with other people that read books. I need to have a screensaver on my computer that shows novels. I need to join a book club. I need to go onto Amazon and buy books. All of these things that will lead me to enact the behaviour are actually quite a lot of separate actions that lead to the final consequence. And we're not very good, by and large, at being able to sort of map out in any degree of detail the things that would be required in order to implement a change insofar as it would be good for us. So there's a couple of reasons why the things that we say in the moment, our intentions, are not very good guide to subsequent behaviour. There's also another thing that I am fundamentally confident about the human condition, is that we suffer from what we call in the literature projection bias. And this is basically where we use our current feelings to project how we're going to feel into the future. So when you go supermarket shopping, unless you have a very clear shopping list that you stick to every time you go shopping, if you go into the supermarket feeling hungry, you're going to buy more food for next week. Now, you've done that many times. This is actually a really good example of where we often don't learn from the things that we get feedback from, because we've all been hungry, we've all eaten food, we've all bought food for the next week, and yet we still, when we're hungry in the supermarket, are more likely to buy food for next week. It's a very powerful effect of our current feelings of hunger projecting into our future decisions about food consumption. Anybody who's been in a relationship and has come out of one, like they've got dumped or something, they're feeling really awful in the first few hours, days, or even weeks after they've got dumped. They project that as going to be something that's going to last forever. And of course, all of us have feedback that it rarely does. So there are many, many instances, and I could trawl the literature through many, many examples of the projection bias. So fundamentally, and actually, it's actually worth saying that even with some really big events that people experience in their lives, not just supermarket shopping or dating or something, but some really, really quite profound one-off events, which could be more analogous to COVID, which of course I'll come to in a second, we don't change that much. So people who have had feedback of some of their health behaviours leading to quite significant adverse consequences, maybe having a stroke or heart attack from some lifestyle-related conditions, many of those people they'll say that that's it, I'm stopping drinking, I'm stopping smoking, I'm stopping doing all these things, and they quickly return to those actions sometime short after. On the positive side, this has all been quite sort of negative examples, but on the positive side, there's been a lot of literature that some people will be familiar with in relation to lottery winners. We've got some good happiness data on lottery winners. One of the things that's less talked about, actually, is that even when lottery winners win quite significant amounts of money, like over $1 million, about 2/3 of those people won't quit their jobs, and they won't reduce the number of hours that they work. So, and I'm sure that when they got the check and they were so excited and elated at having won the lottery, it's like, this is it, my life's changed, I'm going to do something completely different. And actually, most people don't. Most people stick to the job they were doing before and work broadly similar hours than they did before. So even with big life-changing events in our personal lives, there's very little substantively that changes afterwards. So this is the bit that I'm quite conscious of time because I want to get to some of the questions that people might want to ask. But at the individual level, I'm very confident that the literature tells us that most of the things that we think we're going to change or will change in the moment that we're thinking about them changing rarely change that much thereafter. So that's at the individual level. So what would make what could we then say that would translate across into the current situation? Well, this is of course where I have to be much less confident and much more measured and much more circumspect, because actually really no one knows. These are, as many of us have heard in various ways over the last year, unprecedented times. We have no historical background or experience to draw on of a pandemic that is in many ways uniquely an economic, a health and a social crisis simultaneously. We've often had in our previous history an economic crisis. We had a financial crash not that many years ago in 2008. We've had health pandemics, we've had social change, but very rarely have we had this kind of sweet spot, in the worst possible way of a sweet spot, of a health, economic and social crisis simultaneously. So anybody who says to you they know what's going to happen next is essentially selling you snake oil, because no one can fundamentally really know. But there are a few things that I think we can be confident of seeing change in relation to, and we're already seeing some of those changes. I think the airlines are now going to be working to models where the business class flights have essentially disappeared. I mean, we're going to be doing this kind of thing much more now than we did before, and that kind of travel is going to largely disappear, although not completely, I would imagine. People are going to spend much more time working from home, so expensive city centre office space is going to be less desirable, as companies realise that workers can be just as effective and productive in many ways from working from home. It's worth saying, though, of course, that many of the creativity and innovation conversations that take place in the workplace aren't actually done in organised formal settings. So, we might have a meeting that takes place face to face. It's the sort of the chat after the meeting, when we're leaving, when we're having a coffee. That's the time actually where a lot of creativity and innovation in the workplace takes place, and that's what's lost by people working from home, or largely lost by people working from home. So we will return to work. It's just the balance between the number of days and hours that we spend in the office compared to at home will, of course, significantly shift. A central thesis, as you said, is that nothing's going to change, quite as much as we think it is, because in the moment it feels like, quite rightly, that things are really turned upside down and things are so different. But our memories are very, very, very short. And you saw that in the sort of introductory blurb to this talk. I spoke of, remember that try to think of the last time that you were ill, and how you at that time said, I'm really going to remember how good it feels to be healthy again. And actually, I'm also going to do all I can to stay healthy once I'm over this illness. And of course, we all know that once you're back feeling healthy again, you quickly forget how bad you felt when you were ill, and nothing again very much changes very much. So I think a lot of how we're imagining the world changing in this moment of crisis, in all this uncertainty and flux, is not going to translate into anything significantly long-lasting beyond the pandemic. Because, the human condition is the human condition. It's very adaptive, it's very resilient, and it's very forgetful. And so the resilience, the adaptation and the forgetfulness all kind of coalesce to create this sort of perfect storm of most things not changing that much afterwards. And of course, as I say, that's very hard for us to believe in the moment, because it feels like it's so it's so life-changing because it is so life-changing in the moment. What we're not very good at being able to predict is the changes and how those feelings are never or very rarely permanent. So it leads me in conclusion, I think, to say that if there really are fundamentally important, significant individual and social changes that we wish to see come out of the pandemic, to use the crisis as an opportunity to build back better, or what other language that politicians and statesmen have used in order to sort of shape the post-COVID world, then we need to start thinking about how we implement some of those changes now, because our memories will quickly forget what it was like afterwards. And that's part of some of the activities that we're doing at the LSE is to have a sort of agenda of shaping the post-COVID world. Is to kind of try to think about what things we might like to embed now so that they would be sticky afterwards. Because, as I say, as a kind of default position, some things will change. Most things won't change anywhere near as much as we think they will.
Thank you. That was very insightful. Thank you very much, Professor Dolan. I want to have a first question. Actually, to touch base on your point about intention gap. What was the strongest in terms of the most effective motivation you've ever seen or heard of from the government side to its own citizens on some healthy behaviors, for example, or any other good social change?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, one of the things, so I wrote about a decade ago when I was in the UK government and cabinet office, where we were scoping out and setting up the Behavioural Insights team, which is called the Nudge unit now, colloquially. We wrote a report which was called the Mindspace report. It's MINDSPACE, and it's a checklist of the main effects that influence human behaviour in largely unconscious and automatic ways. It's like in the airline industry and in surgical operating theatres, they have very, very simple checklists that they use to work through making a decision and ensuring that flights are safe and that surgical operating theatres are safe. And the Mindspace framework, the reason this came to mind as a response to your question is that the M of Mindspace is messengers. It reminds us that the most important element of a communication is not the message or what's communicated, but who communicates it. So we listen much, much more to the person that's giving us the information than we do to the information itself. And one of the best examples that I've seen of an effective messenger was in Zimbabwe, where hairdressers were trained in HIV prevention and condom use and spoke to their largely female hairdressers, to female clients, and they told them about the benefits of safe sex. Just think how perfect a hairdresser is as a messenger. They have authority because they've been trained in HIV prevention. They're trusted, right? I mean, who doesn't trust their hairdresser, right? And the most important dimension of a messenger is similarity. Someone like me. So it wasn't a faceless authority banging on about safe sex again, blah, blah, blah. It was actually someone that I can relate to, that I both trust and is someone like me. And I think when governments are thinking of effective communication strategies, they often remind themselves of the authority and to some degree the trust. Of course, many of us don't trust our governments, but they very rarely account for the similarity. I'm much more likely to listen to somebody communicating the message that is like me.
Thank you so much.
Already answered my second question about trust.
So we have questions from our viewers. How can the principles of behavioral economics help in a more critical and rational way of perception of information by a wide audience?
Sorry, say that again. Sorry, I didn't. I just my internet went for a second there quickly. What? Can you
I
say
can
that again,
repeat, of
please?
course. How can the principles of behavioral economics help in a more critical and rational way of perception of information by a wide audience?
By a what audience? Sorry, a wide audience.
Wide audience.
A wide audience. Yeah, I think so. The main lesson, which really sort of comes through in partly what I was saying about messengers, really, is that we need to be much more embracing and celebrating of the fact that we aren't these kind of rational, deliberative, thoughtful, sort of Homo economicus creatures. We're not Mr. Spock, and that's actually, we should celebrate that, because if we were to think about making decisions and processing information in ways that were like Mr. Spock, it would take us forever to make a simple decision. Our heads would probably explode. It would be far too much effort. So our automatic system, what's called System 1, our old evolved like reptilian brain, if you like, is making lots of decisions automatically, fast and efficiently, by and large. And so we need to think about ways in which we can kind of go with the grain of that System 1 rather than try to sort of educate and inform System 2. And one of the things that our old evolved system likes is narratives and stories, right? Most people don't really care very much about evidence and data and information. What we like is a good story. We can remember a good story. It's nice to be able to tell a good story. And so if we're thinking about the presentation of evidence and information, we should try to do it in ways that are simple and memorable. And narratives and stories are one important way in which we can do that. The other thing I want to say, which I think is really significant, of course, in the current climate, is the fact that we will often be drawn to one particular narrative or story, right? So the world becomes increasingly polarized into seeing the world through a particular lens, being reinforced to see it those ways through social media, for example, which is a magnification of many elements of the human condition. And very quickly, we can't see how could anybody see this issue or see the world in any other way than the way that I see it? And of course, there's an alternative view that's saying exactly the same thing, but from a completely different perspective. And one of the biggest challenges we face is to essentially show a little more humility and circumspection about what we actually think we know to be true, and to really appreciate and understand that other people can quite legitimately see the world and can process information and evidence in a very different way to the way that we see it.
Thank you. So, Anna, it's your turn.
Yes, we have another question from the audience. Dmitry is asking, what are the peculiarities of the behavior change communication during COVID pandemic when it comes about changing health behavior not related to coronavirus and similar issues? How can we attract people's attention to other health issues, smoking, healthy diet, and others?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, these are super questions. I'm pleased that we've had opportunity to be able to discuss some of these issues. I think one of the most significant behavioral biases in decision making is what's called situational blindness. It basically refers to our tendency to pay attention to something that we think is important because we're paying attention to it. So when I mentioned checklists earlier, the reason that they use checklists in, let's say, the airline industry, which is where they were first used, is because there are many more planes crashing than would otherwise be the case, because pilots were situationally blind to what was important in ensuring a safe flight. So they'd be sitting there in the cockpit looking at the instrumentation and the navigation system and whether the engines are running and everything else, and checking all those things off and saying, we're ready to take off. And they would forget to check whether they had a co-pilot sitting next to them. Now, that's a really very obvious and important safety consideration to have a co-pilot, but they were situationally blind to paying attention to something that was important. So they have checklists that draw their attention away from what they're focusing on and remind them that they need to check whether they have a co-pilot there, and fewer planes crash and fewer people die. What COVID has done, to my mind, is it's again like a magnification of situational blindness, that we've had our attention drawn entirely towards the mortality risks and the morbidity risks and the transmission risks of COVID, and away from all of the other things that also matter in our health and our economy and in our social lives, to the point at which we've kind of engaged maybe in some policy interventions that have had really significant unintended consequences. So, for example, in the UK, when we had the very powerful messaging, and we still do have the very powerful messaging of stay at home, protect the NHS and save lives, that what that meant was literally people were staying at home to protect the NHS, even when they had conditions for which they really ought to have gone to hospital, cancer or stroke or heart attack, which in many ways will, in some instances, will lead to many more years of life lost than might otherwise have been the case had not undue attention been paid to COVID. So I think there's an important lesson in moving forward into future pandemics or future crises, is to have things like checklists that would enable us to consider all of the possible effects of any policy measures that might be directed towards addressing the crisis. Because your question is, right, in the sense that there are all these other significant health and economic and social considerations that are clearly important, and there is a danger that our focus and fixation on COVID has crowded out an opportunity to more fully consider some of those effects.
Thank you. Now we have another question. How do different conspiracy theories could affect the risks of a better post-COVID world, and how we would fight against them, and do we need to fight against them?
Yeah, so conspiracy theories. One of the things, again, another fundamental condition of the human species is that we love to talk and we love gossip, right? So you find out something about someone or something, and you can't wait to tell me, right? Because you like to know, like it's good to be the person that knows stuff, right? So, and you say, oh, listen, I've got a secret, don't tell anybody. And you say that, please don't tell anybody. So I think that makes it very, very difficult for conspiracy theories to be able to hold, right? It really, it would require an awfully large number of people to keep their mouths shut in ways that we're not predisposed to do. So I'm generally very suspicious of any conspiracy theory, because I think it just requires too much of us for it not to come out. Someone would find out about it, and we'd be talking about it, and we'd know that what the conspiracy was quite quickly. That isn't to say that there aren't ways in which governments and the media are able to manipulate situations and to present evidence and information. We talked just now about the focus on COVID mortality, morbidity, and transmission risks. I mean, in the UK, on all of our mainstream news channels, all of them since March last year, we've been presented with three main statistics, which are the number of people who have tested positive, number of people in hospital, and the deaths from COVID. Those numbers are never placed in any context. Most people won't know. We don't know what proportion of the population they represent. Even if you took, for example, the COVID deaths, how many deaths would otherwise have been expected to occur on that day, say taking a 5-year rolling average? That's actually data that's very easy to present, and would give people context for the number of COVID deaths. And we would see actually at various points during this pandemic that there's been significant excess deaths at various points. At other points, there's been hardly any. And so that's very important information that people would be able to understand, I think, that isn't being presented. So there is a sense whether, it's a conspiracy, but there's at least a manipulation to some extent taking place, because the way in which we present information is never benign. And so a decision is made to kind of, to impress upon us the significance and the severity of COVID. So whilst I think conspiracy theories are very unlikely, there's the kind of environment to create a conspiracy is very unlikely. That's not to say that governments and the media don't manipulate messages in ways that make it more likely to bring about a particular response.
Thank you. Anna?
I have a question, because actually listening to you, I feel privileged so much that I'm at the lecture in LSE, and now, you will be telling all the knowledge that you have there. But what tips would you give to communicators, communication professionals, behavior change communication experts here in Ukraine to widen their knowledge, to widen their views as well? What to read, whom to listen? A very practical question. What would your recommendations, top 5 or maybe more?
And whom to believe?
Well, who to believe? Well, obviously me, and obviously my books. So that's two books: Happiness by Design and Happy Ever After. That's clearly where everybody ought to read and where everybody ought to go. I had the great privilege of working with Danny Kahneman in Princeton, and he's a Nobel Prize winner in economics. He's a psychologist by background. He wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, which is a very, very, very successful book. It's sold huge amounts of copy around the world, and it's a very, it's like a treatise of behavioral science. It's a very scholarly book, but written with a nice storytelling style. I would strongly recommend anybody who is interested in understanding behavioral science more or better to read that book. That's actually probably the best starting point for anybody.
And one more question,
But one of the things actually to say that there are we were talking before, weren't we, about how sort of many things have changed, but most won't. The university sector, at least in the UK, has spent for the last 20 years saying it's impossible to go online. We can't do our teaching online. It's all these hurdles and barriers and obstacles, and then sort of 2 weeks in March, we managed to move everything to online teaching. So it shows how you can respond. It is possible to respond to the world when you really have to. And one of the great things that's done is that it's meant that many of our public events, our public lectures, events that I've been engaged in at the LSE over the last year are now all online as podcasts. People can access those. I think they get quite a significant number of downloads of those. So there's, events throughout the COVID crisis that have talked about COVID, but other things too that people can access through the LSE. So that's actually really quite a nice way for those people that don't like reading stuff. I think podcasts are increasingly attractive because people can listen to them whilst they're on their run or whilst they're going out for a walk and things. And so I think that's quite a valuable resource as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. We have one more lifestyle question. What are the effective tools for turning desire into action?
Yeah, so I think so. The first, I do want to emphasise the point about just to really seriously consider whether that desire is something that is good for you. I think I talk a lot about this more in Happy Ever After, the second book, than Happiness by Design, which is to really be clear about whether there aren't these stories and narratives that you think you might be living in. But insofar as it is a desire that would make you and people that you care about happier, I think it speaks to what is then in Happiness by Design, which is where I started. Really, is that is you need to have a very clear plan about how you're going to design your life, organize your day, use your time in ways that make it easier for you to enact the desire. Because it's not about willpower, it's about design power. It's about being able to do the simple things in a routine way that will bring about effective behavior change, and to stick to it. So some of the literature on changing health behaviors, for example, suggests that it takes about 2 months to change a habit. Now, on the one hand, 2 months doesn't sound very long. On the other hand, 2 months is a very long time, because you think about a lot of what we try to change, we stick at it for a week or 2 or 3, and then we stop, and it's too soon before it's become a habit. So if you are very confident that something that you want to change is going to make you happier, that's the first step. If you are very confident about that happening, make it simple for you to enact the behavior change on a daily basis, step by step, with a series of discrete behaviors that lead you to the final consequence, and stick at it for 2 months.
There's one question that I particularly like, and I want to ask that one. Do you see any significant difference in your area of expertise between generations? And are we, like human beings, becoming more or less intelligent from your personal point of view?
Oh, what a wonderful question to finish on. So what? Let me give another behavioral bias that we suffer from. When you're making a comparison between any two objects, 2 pairs of shoes, 2 cars, 2 houses, or 2 generations, you look for what makes them different, because that's how the basis on which you're going to decide which one you prefer or how much. What you don't look for is what makes them similar. And actually, there's many more things that make many of the choices that we make similar to one another and not different. And I think we suffer from that same bias when we look at generations. You know, what makes Gen Z or iGen or whatever different from Gen X or the baby boomers, not what makes them similar. And there are many things that make us similar. Many things of the human condition have evolved through billions of years. They're not suddenly going to shift in one generation. What is interesting, if there are any changes or any differences, is the magnification that takes place through social media and technology. That's potentially very, very interesting. Nothing that social media ever does is creating anything different about us. It doesn't make us different. But what it does is it magnifies pre-existing tendencies. And so I think that's, if we're going to be looking at where generations might differ, I think that's where our focus of emphasis should be on, is where new technologies might be magnifying some of what's already pre-existing. But I do by and large think that the talk of generational difference is largely talk. I mean, there is, people are not that much different from one generation to the next.
Thank you so much. So we have to finish. I'm really sorry to finish this session, because it's a pleasure to chat with you. Maybe you have some personal question to Paul, or
tons of questions, but we will not take the time from the audience for that. That was really lovely discussion and very interesting insights from you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you. I really do hope we get to see one another face to face at some point.
Yes, definitely.
And thank you all very much to your audience for paying attention. Thank you.
Well, I really hope that your nearest public speech performance going to happen here in Kiev.
I'd love that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much once again for this presentation, and I'm confident that your research and conclusions about the post-pandemic world will help our audience look at the main messages of communication programs from a new angle. Thank you so much once again. Ну що, і я думаю, вам теж велике.
So thank you for keeping me company. We have spent great time speaking with Paul, and thank you so much. We're not saying goodbye. Me and Anna will meet back again later on today at a panel discussion, so do not wander off, and let's see what's gonna come up next.